So the core web vitals are the future of web performance measurement, or at least they are in Google's mind. And Google have really the people who have sort of come up with this new metric and who are pushing it forward. So I just wanted to talk a little bit before we sort of really get underway about why performance is so important. I've just pulled some stats that I thought were particularly interesting. I've got all of these stats from a site called WPO Stats, or Web Performance Optimization Stats.com, which has lots of interesting sort of nuggets of anecdotal information about companies who have made their websites faster and who have saved lots of money as a result. And so being observed that for every 10 milliseconds that an engineer can shave off the server, how quickly a server serves its pages, the increased revenue from that faster web page will more than pay for that engineer's annual wages. So Web Vitals is an initiative by Google to provide unified guidance for quality signals that are essential to delivering a great user experience on the web. So what does that actually mean? Well, it's really an effort to try and take the dozens of ways of measuring web performance and unifying them into the signals that really matter. It's also much more focused on what a user really experiences, whereas the early performance metrics were slightly more artificial, didn't accurately reflect how users were really experiencing pages in quite the right way. Core Web Vitals is very much focused on performance, but Google talk about it being part of a sort of wider package of vital signals that also includes things like, is it running HTTPS, is it mobile friendly, and so the core Web Vitals are 3 metrics. These are cumulative layout shift, first input delay, and largest contentful paint. A bit later on, I'll go into what these actually mean in a bit more detail. And then they talk about there being other Web Vitals that aren't core Web Vitals, but still important. And these are first contentful paint, time to first byte, total blocking time, time to interactive, and others. But what they've tried to do with the core Web Vitals is find metrics where, or other vitals are good or bad, the core Web Vitals should sort of pick up on that. So just to give an example, if your time to first byte is bad, that will be reflected in your largest contentful paint and first input delay type metrics. So I think it's helpful to have a brief look at the history of web performance to sort of see how we've got to that have been introduced in the last year or so. So it's really around 2010 that people really started to think about web performance, I think. And it was around this time that Google introduced page speed as a ranking factor, which really sort of drove adoption of people thinking, well, actually, we need to figure out how to make our sites fast. And so in the sort of period from 2010 to 2016-ish, the focus was very much on delivering as few bytes as quickly as possible. And this was what most of the sort of tooling checked for, and the sort of recommendations and best practices, the sort of conversation focused around these metrics. So things like reducing the total page weight, reducing the time to first byte, minification and concatenation, optimizing images, gzipping text resources. And actually, all of these are still best practices today. Possibly less so with minification and concatenation, because HTTP2 somewhat makes those less relevant, but more or less these are all still best practices. But I think
minificate. Do you mean concatenation, Bradley? Takes away, presumably doesn't change minification as a best practice.
No, but it becomes less important because HTTP2 does more of that sort of by default.
Okay.
So it's much more optimized in terms of how it actually delivers your assets. But it's certainly not going to do any harm, or very unlikely to. But in the last few years, there's been a sort of move towards other metrics that cover a broader spectrum of things we want to be checking. So one thing that these metrics don't really take into account is the impact of JavaScript and how JavaScript is often the sort of bottleneck, especially on underpowered mobile devices. And that's especially true with sort of single-page applications, React-heavy applications, and things like Angular and Vue. And so JavaScript can take a significant amount of time to run, even after the actual assets have been downloaded over the network. More broadly, single-page applications are more difficult to measure from a performance point of view because the idea of a sort of page is a bit less well defined. So it's not always so clear exactly what you should be measuring where. And there's a focus on lab metrics, which don't always represent reality. So what do I mean by lab metrics? That's really a good example is when you're testing stuff on a local development system on a developer's machine, or perhaps in something like a build system. These aren't the devices which real users are using, and so there might be conditions that don't accurately reflect reality. But as I said previously, 2010, page speed became a ranking factor on desktop. 2016, we had the introduction of Google Lighthouse. And so Google Lighthouse is a tool that provides a series of checks for mostly performance, but also SEO best practices, accessibility best practices, PWA best practices if your app's a progressive web app. And it provided a series of suggested improvements. And this sort of built on the earlier web page test type stuff and PageSpeed Insights. And PageSpeed Insights is now actually running Google Lighthouse today. So Google Lighthouse is a sort of underlying set of libraries that's exposed in various ways. It's what Google uses when you run PageSpeed Insights, built into Chrome DevTools. You can run it from the command line if you want to, and in other places as well. So a year later, we had the introduction of the Chrome User Experience Report. Surprised it's so long ago this was introduced, actually, because it still feels very recent. But I think this was a sort of big step forward in being able to see exactly how users were really experiencing websites. The Chrome User Experience Report is powered by real user measurements across the public web, aggregated from users who have opted in to syncing their browsing history, who have not set up a passphrase, and have usage statistic reporting enabled. So in other words, the Chrome User Experience Report tells you how fast or how slow real users are experiencing various web pages. There's a really large data set that's updated, I think, every month, and is made available as a BigQuery database that anyone can query if you like. And there's now some very interesting statistics that have been sort of called out of this data set, and people have sort of done some interesting research looking at how people were interacting with the web as a whole, and looking at sort of variations and similarities between websites and sort of drawing patterns between what makes a fast and slow website. And so the Chrome User Experience Report is now built into Google's PageSpeed Insights. And so this screenshot here is from Google's PageSpeed Insights, showing real data from real users on an individual page and over the origin, or in other words, the domain as a whole, for the various core web vitals such as first contentful paint, first input delay, etc. This is obviously much more accurate than if you just run something on your local machine, because it sort of takes into account how your users are really interacting with your site, and also the sort of devices they're using. So it's true that if a site audience is mostly using, say, 3G or slow mobile networks, they've got a sort of tougher hill to climb to get good metrics when it comes to the Chrome User Experience Report. But that's still very valuable information to know, because you should be optimizing for your users rather than a sort of arbitrary set of best practices. And so moving on, 2018, page speed becomes a ranking factor on mobile. Forward again to sort of more or less present day. Last year, the core web vitals were introduced. So, the first core web vital is cumulative layout shift. And this is a metric that's best illustrated with so you can sort of see what happened there. Something loaded into the page after the initial page load, and caused the rest of the page to shift down. And this was sort of an extreme example. In this case, it pushed the place my order button down, so your order was accidentally placed rather than cancelled. But I'm sure this is the sort of thing we've all experienced, although probably not on a order confirmation screen. So somewhere you often see this is with images loading. If you're reading a sort of news article and images or maybe adverts load in after the page is loaded, and you sort of lose track of where your place was, lose track of what line you were reading because it sort of jumps about. And so the metric is really measuring how much the layout shifts loaded. And more or less, pages should only be shifting around after page load as a result of some user action. So in other words, if a user clicks a button and something moves around, that's perfectly okay, because they've sort of triggered that, but you shouldn't have it just shifting around without the user having done something, either on page load or at a later point in the sort of life cycle of the page. So sort of a few technical details about how we can avoid this. Thing is to always define the size of images and video elements, so that the browser can sort of reserve space for those image and video elements before the images have actually been downloaded. Another thing is to never insert content above existing content except in response to user interaction. And so this avoids the sort of thing we saw previously, where a sort of promo was inserted at the top of a page and caused everything else to sort of jump down. And then performing transformer animations to animations of properties that trigger layout changes. And so this means that you shouldn't be animating things like width and height or margins or padding, because these all cause layout shifts. If you're doing animations, you should always be animating CSS properties like transition or transform, or just transform, sorry. Things like opacity are fine, because again, they don't cause an actual shift in layout, they just change the shift in what it looks like. So the next one of the core Web Vital metrics is first input delay. So first input delay measures the time from when a user first interacts with a page. In other words, when they first click a link, tap a button, use a custom control, to the time when the browser is actually able to begin processing that event. So what this is saying is you shouldn't have cases where something like a menu button is a good example. A page loads, you start tapping the menu button, but actually it takes a few seconds before the menu opens because the browser is doing other processing in the background. If we go very technical, JavaScript all runs on a single thread, and so the actual loading of a page limits how the browser can respond to user interaction if you've got other stuff loading in the background. And again, this is measured in milliseconds of the first input delay on the first input that the user makes. And really the best way to avoid a slow first input delay metric is to just ship less JavaScript. The more JavaScript you have, the longer periods of blocking time you're likely to experience. On some devices and in some browsers, images being decoded can actually also have an impact because they can also block the main thread. There's less you can do there, but sort of serving appropriately sized images certainly helps. And then the last core Web Vital is largest contentful paint. And so the largest contentful paint metric reports the render time of the largest image or text block visible within the viewport. And so the idea here is that when you come to a page, you're generally interested in the sort of largest bit of content. So you sort of don't really care if the logo and the header loads quickly, or you don't really care if you know, some sort of visual flourish loads quickly. What you really want is the text or the biggest image, which is what you've come to see. And so this metric is upfront about the fact that it's okay or beneficial to defer loading of less important elements, possibly using lazy loading techniques to really focus on delivering the core content quickly. And again, this is measured in the number of seconds once the page is loaded before the largest contentful element is rendered.
Can I ask a quick question there, Bradley?
You can.
Largest contentful paint need to be above the fold, one would have thought.
Yes, it does.
Surprised to see those times. Worse than 2.5 seconds to get above the fold painted. This would be a catastrophe. Those times, you see what I mean? They seem very odd to me.
I do know what you mean. I mean, when Google are talking about their timings and when Lighthouse runs, they're basically considering the worst possible scenario. So what you're really looking at here is it should be 2.5 seconds, even if you're on a 50 quid phone on a slow network in India.
Right, fair enough.
So I think they tend to say it should be within 2.5 seconds for 95% or something like that of your users across all networks, regardless of, sort of what conditions that's under.
Right, thanks.
And so all sites should meet all 3 metrics in Google's eyes. So I've talked a little bit about the Chrome user experience report. And so at some point last year, Google made available the Chrome user experience dashboard. So let's go through this now. So what you can do is enter a origin URL. I'm not going to use brightminded.com as we might not have enough traffic to get good metrics. But if I just take BBC as an example. Okay, it might need to be www. I think I pressed the wrong button there. Built now is a Google Data Studio report showing how real users have interacted with this origin bbc.co.uk over a period of your choosing. And so we can see that they're doing really rather well on all the metrics, really. And we could sort of filter it to just show by phone. They're doing slightly less well. And you can sort of drill down and look at how these metrics have changed over time. So again, this is with real users using Chrome. And so you can see how this is really quite valuable information. They also provide other metrics, time to first byte, so you can see that 85% of time to first bytes on the BBC Origin are under half a second. Connection distribution. It's worth saying where it says 4G here, it means 4G or faster. So that includes sort of home broadband networks or office broadband networks. And so, yeah, I think this is a very sort of neat report to know of, and you can look up your own origins and see how you're doing. It can also be valuable to sort of compare to competitors' origins. Is of course all you really want to be doing with page speed when it comes to SEO is doing better than your competitors in order to hopefully overtake them in. And so Core Web Vitals, based on this Chrome user experience report of real users, becomes a ranking factor in May. and so that's why I thought it was relevant to sort of talk about it, and interesting to sort of see how Google feels these are the metrics that people should be focusing on. Indication of how fast or slow a site is.
Yeah, interesting. And Bradley, you mentioned that you didn't look at Bright-Minded because there might not be enough traffic to generate the user reports. Do you know? Do they only become? I mean, I guess this kind of thing is not usually said explicitly anywhere, but does it need a certain level of traffic before those metrics are used?
Yeah, you need a certain level of traffic before Google will include an origin in the report. Some of that is to preserve people's privacy. If you've only got one user, it sort of that makes it easier to, track individual users. Even before this change, as we saw, ranking factor. So I guess for low traffic origins, for sort of whatever they're doing at the moment, probably based on Lighthouse sort of lab metrics, will be what they'll be using.
Bradley, I've got a quick question. The this becoming a ranking factor in May, is that in place of existing page speed ranking factors, or is it in addition to?
Unclear. Know what Google's like, they never really tell you anything, but
Yeah,
I'd imagine that this would probably be in place of. There's more or less, if you meet these metrics, you're probably going to be meeting all the traditional ones.
yeah.
Things I've always found frustrating about all of these reports is a sense of defeat that can arise, especially if there doesn't appear to be a great deal you can do about it. Do these new metrics look to you like there is a decent set of best practices that engineers can learn in order to stand a chance?
Yeah, I guess what these don't really do is simplify the actual job of meeting the metrics, but they do simplify the task of understanding whether you're meeting them in the first place. So it can still be difficult to get a low first input delay, for example. That's a sort of very, very difficult one to actually optimize for, but it's an important metric, so you sort of should.
That was one that had a 300 milliseconds to fit inside the good. Now, if that's on your worst possible phone, that if you compare that to the 2.5 second or 2,500 millisecond page load business, that one seems harsh, really, really difficult, because there is so little sometimes you can do about that.
Yeah, I agree. Although I guess it sort of reflects sort of how the JavaScript interpreter is running. You shouldn't really be having really long blocks of solid processing without gaps in the middle. Whereas if there's a gap, the browser should process for user interaction between running different functions or whatever. This one I think is really, really difficult to optimize for, and slightly beyond me, if I'm being honest, in terms of really understanding how the deep internals of JavaScript processing in browsers work. It is really just about reducing the amount of JavaScript being loaded and possibly sort of lazy loading JavaScript on demand as bits needed.
An interesting question there, in fact, because there have been times when we have seen that Google Analytics has been the pig for our page speeds. that is doing the damage. And if you get rid of Google Analytics, it works much better. Presumably, there's a lump of JavaScript that Google are loading in order to acquire these statistics. And they still think that
well,
for a page and their analytics, forget your JavaScript. It's just clearly they're getting some data.
I mean, it's not really JavaScript generating these metrics. They're built into Chrome at a sort of low level now, and then exposed as JavaScript methods to get that if you want to pass it on to Google Analytics or whatever. So the Google Analytics is a case where the all sort of 2010 to 2016 style metrics weren't great, actually, because they sort of moaned excessively about things like Google Analytics not being cached for 30 days, was really, it doesn't make that great deal of difference, because you've loaded it once that day and it's run. It's actually very quick to run. You know, it's not doing that much processing. It's not that heavy. And so it can sort of look like it's much worse than it actually is. This is why I think these new tools like Lighthouse and these new metrics do a better job of getting to the heart of where the real problems are.
Any thoughts from developers who get to feel bad when they get a bad score from Google?
If these metrics are calculated at the Chrome level, how do they differentiate when it's the operating system or the machine's performance against the actual server performance?
That's sort of a point. They don't. If you've got a
the broadband that you have available.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point Google would make is if your users are on ridiculously underpowered phones on ridiculously slow networks, you should just figure out how to still be within the metrics for that class of audience. And that probably means delivering much less resources, not running JavaScript, etc., etc. Yeah.
Sure.
And if your audience is all on sort of fast fiber networks on expensive MacBooks, then you have less work to do. And Google again says, well, fair enough, they're getting a good experience, so why do better than that?
So what do? They average over all the users from BBC, from all the browsers?
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
I don't know if it's I don't know if it's exactly an average because there's percentiles and stuff involved, and that report is just doing the sort of SQL queries on the BigQuery table.
Even an average would skew if you have, like suddenly a large number of outliers. The value would be, if you have a lot of traffic from, people that are likely to use BBC a lot, or people that get it fast. And so that would be, the average would be skewed to most of the people that use the fast. They must be using like a weighted averaging or something.
Yeah, I think they are.
Thanks.
I noticed, Bradley, is that Chrome extension you've got for the Web Vitals?
It is, yes.
Is that useful? Have you been using that for long?
So when they first brought it out, it had a bug where if you had it installed and were doing a meet like this, something was constantly doing a relayout and it just caused your CPU to go like crazy. But they seem to have fixed that. So I've had it installed for about a week now. So too early to really say, but I think it could be. I think one thing that's interesting is Google are trying to encourage people to sort of be better than they are now. So most sites are considered a sort of failure by the sort of guidelines which Google suggests.
Does that imply that Google standards are too high?
Possibly.
I would observe that the internet is not exactly a failure in and of itself.
I mean, the way they do it on the Lighthouse scores are quite good, I think, actually. They basically, the 50 points mark is always equal to the exact sort of average, and then they have a sort of weighted distribution of. So basically, it's very difficult to get over 90, and you shouldn't really bother. And very few people will be in that bottom 10, and they update the scores, I think, every month or so to reflect the current state of the web. So they're trying to do it so that the sort of 50% or sort of halfway mark is roughly equal to where most people are, and then try and get people to go slightly above that to hopefully try and incrementally improve how fast the web is over time.
Are there any other tools that you use or would recommend that we use just in our day-to-day, and also just things to maybe keep an eye out for that can often, cause problems when it comes to page speed rankings?
Well, I think the largest Contentful paint and are really interesting ones, which are not really metrics people have talked about until recently. I mean, actually, there was a metric called speed index, which was quite popular for a while, but it was so difficult to understand, no one really knew what it meant. So I think those are two good metrics Google have come up with. The one about your page shifting around after it's loaded. I think that's an issue I definitely see often.
I thought that was great because it is truly annoying, but it's a shifty technique for getting it's gamed by page speed in the first place, isn't it? Behaving like that and loading your JavaScript to install adverts late and so on, so the adverts cause these things. That problem has been exacerbated by page speed in 2010, I suspect, as a technique to get your time to first byte faster. So it's very pleasing to see that as a metric.
Have we ever avoided implementing any features because we didn't want to add to the load on the page or anything like that? Because another way of looking at it is that if you could do more things in a more optimized way, you could possibly add more to that you wouldn't do.
Yeah, I mean, it can be difficult to convince people that they don't really want what they're asking for at times. There's definitely been cases where we sort of looked into performance after a site's been built and made recommendations and implemented improvements. I remember doing a report for Jitendra actually when I was at Rickshaw, and we found that a library that had been installed and forgotten about was blocking the main thread by something like 2 or 3 seconds on mobile devices. Dreadful for that first input delay, and so we've removed it, and
we found quite a lot of things on that, didn't we? But I think as well, that brings up quite a good point that the people using the admin of the website and the content that they add, because that obviously has a big impact.
I think images are particularly difficult, actually.
Yeah, I mean, images in a responsive site are difficult. In a responsive site, are difficult to come up with appropriate guidelines for. But I guess we should be, now that we're using, well, I don't know, Bradley, what do you think now that we tend to use PageSpeed module on the server by default? Does that mitigate most of the problems associated with people choosing enormous images to upload? I guess a combination of custom image sizes plus page speed on the module on server.
Yeah, I think what PageSpeed module can't know is the context in which that image is eventually going to be displayed once the CSS come in. So it can't know what the appropriate width for that image should be, for example.
Yeah.
Bradley, what do you think about static site generators? In terms of images, what I've found about them is that they try to load the appropriate image depending on the a couple of factors, which include the network speed, the device rate. So your images are actually compiled down to blob format and then rebuilt based on the device requested for the image. So what do you think the impact of static site generators would have on?
So I think the big win of static site generators is that they massively get the time to first byte down. I mean, what you do sometimes find with static sites is because you don't have a server component, people add more JavaScript to try and sort of compensate for lack of being able to do stuff on the server, which so you can sort of win in one area and lose in another. Images, I know there's some static site generators that do clever stuff there. I'm not overly familiar with any of them though.
I was going to ask also, are there any tools that go into the details of, telling you about whether there's a lot of JavaScript on your page that is causing a certain metric on the call vitals to deplete?
Yeah, I think the Lighthouse tool is a good place to start. I think really focusing on the sort of, it breaks it down by like, I can't remember the exact wording it used, but opportunities basically for probably improving your speed. One thing Lighthouse has started doing, which I really like, is attributing weight and JavaScript processing time to individual libraries, which makes it quite easy to see, this live chat is thread for X amount of time, so this is one to get rid of, and for example. So yeah, I think Lighthouse is probably the most approachable and best tool. If you want to dig deeper in that, Chrome DevTools, you can sort of run custom profiles. That's good, but quite difficult to really understand what's going on there. Web Page Test is a good site. Again, quite a sort of detailed, advanced set of.
Dan mentioned PageSpeed module on the server. Could you just explain a bit about what that does and how it works?
Yeah, so essentially it's a Apache module. I think there's an Nginx version as well. And essentially it processes the outbound requests and does various modifications to try and optimize them. So there's all sorts of stuff it can do. We don't have all the features turned on, but for example, it will automatically do sort of gzipping and stuff. It will optimize your images. I think you can configure it to resize your images, but like I say, it can't do that perfectly. I think it can sort of minify your CSS and stuff if you want that. The image optimization.
I think that's all. There's a million different configuration options for it, and I think you're right that I think we tend to just have the image optimization, the sort of default image optimization turned on because we do our own concatenation and minification. But those are certainly things that it And even within the image optimization, there's so many different options there. But what's it? So Bradley, it's generally it's going to it will generate WebP images, and it will.
Well, I don't know if it does it actually. I don't remember having ever seen a WebP come from.
I had it for a while that I used it. I had it generating WebP images.
It feels like something it should be doing.
I think it does. I think I've because we yeah, I think it does do that. It's all and it will cache all of those. What is it doing in terms of looking at the devices, in terms of responding to different devices that are requesting the images?
Yeah, I don't know how smart it is there. I mean, certainly in terms of WebP, it'll be looking at the accepts header to see does it support WebP.
Yeah, I must admit I can't remember all of the various options that it's got, but we tend to just go for the default and assume that that's good enough.
Is there any more information on the significance of the time to first byte? I assume that if you've got a website that's using lots of ADAPs and has two-way communication, then you're going to get multiplied for each request.
So time to first byte is just around how quickly the server responds to requests. So not related to your JavaScript at all. It sounds like you might have been getting confused with first input delay, which is around how quickly the taps of buttons and stuff. Time to first byte is really important because it has a knock-on effect on everything else. If it takes a second for the initial HTML to load, that's a second added on to basically every other metric.
I was thinking about like with online gaming, you can have perfectly fine bandwidth and streaming speed, but there can be a lag, which is like your ping time for when you first made the request, for how long something takes to get back. And if you've got a lot of lag, then it's because you want your person to twist or something as soon as you move the mouse and not a second after when you're playing against other people.
Yeah, I mean, I guess time to first byte must be affected by your network speed, but what we're interested in here more is how long it's taking the server to do it and start delivering the...
In fact, I'm not sure it is affected by your network speed, because I think the browser, basically the SSL handshake time, and then the connection time, and then the time to first byte from that. If you look in DevTools, you can see it broken down into about 5 stages.
Okay.
So yeah, time to first byte is really...
It's got that timestamp when the server has started pushing it, regardless of how long it's going to take to get to you.
Yeah, basically at what point has Nginx or Apache acknowledged that there's a connection? You know, or it might even be lower at that, and from that at the operating system level.
Wasn't David's point that it will take Apache 5, 10, 20, 300 milliseconds, depending on how far away it is? The hops, whether it's got to go under the Atlantic or via a couple of satellites, that ping time does matter. Because Apache can say, all right, I'm sending you a response, but if it takes 3 minutes for you to hear that.
But I think what Bradley's saying is that the time to first byte measurement affected by how long it takes to get back to you.
I mean, sure, you could be... Yeah, if it's taking 5 seconds for your ping, then none of these metrics are going to be all that useful, because that's, extreme conditions.
One of the reasons I find interesting is because, as you say, it makes it, even if you've got a fast bandwidth and a fast speed, it makes all the difference in gaming. And so it's an application, and as the internet network has got better, it's changed the internet quite a lot, loading things from the server to two-way sort of AJAX communication. It's a different design of site. And one of the things they're looking with 5G is that it doesn't necessarily always change your speed or your bandwidth much, but you get a much better sort of, there's a lot less delay and ping time. And so looking at the Sussex Innovation Centre is what are the new applications going to be. Yeah, so I hadn't really thought about the design of websites. So it would be interesting to see what impact that has on the application of the web.
You'd probably be interested in reading a bit more about HTTP2 as well, David. That sort of changed how we sort of see some best practices around stuff like concatenation, and my understanding is basically that connections aren't open and closed in the sort of traditional way they have been for most of the life of HTTP. They're done in a sort of more dynamic level way.
Yeah, that does.
So I think
the only example. It sounds quite sci-fi. Is in Shenzhen, when they've rolled out 5G, they've got warehouses that are now underground and people working from home controlling the robots to move things around and so on. I think that's still a little bit far-fetched and probably more of a demo. But yeah, I hadn't really thought about what will be on.
Yeah, be interesting to see how that develops.
But they will be just as slow as they are stuff.
Yeah. But possibly different applications. The thing that was, as would happened with social media and Web 2.0.
I mean, in terms of fast time to first bytes, I was on government page the other day and I refreshed it. I honestly thought it hadn't refreshed it so quick. I had to press refresh 2 or 3 times before I realised that actually it was just responding instantaneously. Yeah, thought it was interesting. I almost felt awkwardly slow because I had to refresh it 5 or 6 times to check it had worked. Shows how slow everything else is.
Errors on the other side of the keyboard there.
Kind of things they're doing that make them perform so much better than most sites.
Heavy caching. Basically, if you don't have any server side component, you can render instantaneously. It's just still fairly rare for people to be doing that.
It's also a very, very low image level and so on, isn't it? It's a site that's designed for spectacular accessibility and straightforwardness of information. So generally, images and or any form of rich media content.
Yeah, the images should download later anyway. For HTML gets streamed first and then images downloaded and put in place after. That's why adding width and height attributes to your images is so important for reducing the layout shift.
Any more questions out there?
I was just thinking there may be people here who have never seen the beauty of the FlowCert text-only site that we built for them. So I'll just drop that into the chat. So because FlowCert, one of our customers, have people, lots of producers and farmers in remote parts of the world. So we've built them a text-only version, which looks like the internet from 1990. But so that's an extreme example of. I mean, have you ever looked at the scores for that, Bradley?
I think probably 100 out of 100 because
we're about to break it because they want to stick Google Analytics on it for the first time. But
I wonder if I could, if it's got enough data to do a Chrome UX report.
It's also, if anybody hasn't seen that as well, well, you may have seen it if you've ever looked at FlowCert and your internet connection is incredibly slow, because it pops up a splash screen saying it looks like you're trying to connect to this from a with a slow connection. Do you want to switch to the text only version?
Oh. Not as good as you might have expected.
That is
surprising. Yeah.
I wonder if, well,
what's the largest contentful? What's it going to be? What's it considering the largest contentful pane in on that text?
Almost certainly
The entire page.
Almost certainly. What do you think, Bradley?
Almost certainly the block of text. They do have a good description. The algorithm for deciding what's the largest contentful pane is, but
here we go. This is better. This is more like with what we'd be expecting.
Yeah.
This should be there should be no shifting going on here, should there?
Possibly the logo. I mean, do we have width height attributes on that? So we've got a width attribute. We don't actually have a height attribute. So
okay. Yeah.
Which tab was I? This is where the long first contentful pane is coming from. Time for the first byte is poor.
Are we not? I mean, don't tell me we're not caching the text only site.
We are, but if it has no visitors.
Right.
The waste of time.
Because it resets every 24 hours or something.
Yeah.
Also, if this is based on real data of people who really are farmers in the Amazon rainforest who've got to have their kid pedaling a bike to generate some power to drive the satellite link, you know, then you're definitely looking at the roughest possible end of hardware and network connectivity, aren't you?
Well, I guess it depends on what. Yeah, I mean, it depends on whether what Bradley was saying about that time to first byte, whether that actually is network dependent or not.
Although interestingly, everyone who's visited this page has done so on 4G, so it's probably not being used by the original market.
No.
Yeah.
If it had analytics, you could see that we're the only people who ever look at it.
Yeah.
I mean, Google in really slow markets do have their own tool where they basically repackage up web pages in a really cut down format and serve those instead.
I worked with somebody who was doing that as part of a sort of charity project a long time ago, probably 1997. That they were they provided a service where you routed your URL via that, and it did this for you. Sounds like a similar thing.
Yeah, I don't know what markets Google uses that, but certainly some.
Great, very interesting. Thanks, Bradley.
Yeah, thanks, Bradley.
Welcome.